From 1991 to 2004, a depraved creature took the lives of 5 people, including his own brother. Zoltan Ember started with his abusive alcoholic stepfather, using a wrench to crush his skull. The rest he strangled with either his bare hands, as in the case of his brother, or his preferred method, tying them up, so that as they struggled, the rope tightened around their throat. Once the evil act was done, Zoltan would ransack their homes, taking whatever he could. Keep in mind that most of this monster's victims were in their 80s and lived in the same small Hungarian village as him, essentially his neighbors, making Ember even more pathetic and evil. Apologies in advance, I'm probably going to mangle some of the pronunciation in this video. But Zoltan Ember was born in 1962 and grew up in the Hungarian village, Szentkeralszabadja. The area had 2 separate social infrastructures, the villagers themselves, and then the Soviet military installation. Ember's home life was less than ideal. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and even after he passed away, the mistreatment continued. Zoltan's mother married a man named István Vengeli, who was more or less the same as the father, without the blood ties. The resentment began to build against István, and in time it would reach a breaking point. Zoltan dropped out of school early after elementary school and began working as a butcher. But Zoltan would not spend long in this profession, and soon made a living by working odd jobs. His primary source of legitimate income was as labor at construction sites, but he had other means of making money. And by the time he was 25, he had been prosecuted for nearly a dozen offenses and had been locked up several times. In 1987, after a release from prison, Zoltan moved out of his parents' house and in with a handful of women. A year later, he was living with a woman named Julie. Zoltan would demonstrate some of the evil that he was capable of when during an argument he stabbed Julie in the back. Wikipedia has this as the previous girlfriend named Ludmila, but cites a Hungarian article that has Julie as the victim. Thankfully, she survived the attack, and he would once again be sent to prison, but he received only 3 years for causing life-threatening bodily harm rather than attempted murder. Once he got out of prison, Zoltan embraced crime and gave in to his vicious impulses. His first stop was at his parents' house to pay a visit on his stepfather on October 12, 1991. Using a wrench, he clubbed István Vengeli before robbing him. Zoltan would later say that one of his reasons for taking what he did was that he had wanted to go to the village harvest ball, but he had no money after being in prison. As police investigated the homicide, Zoltan became a person of interest. But despite being interrogated, investigators did not have enough evidence, and so the crime went unsolved. And for a while it seemed like the monster was able to restrain his murderous impulses, but he continued to fund his gambling and drinking habits through relatively low-level crime. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, which led to a massive change in Hungary as military outposts were more or less deserted in some cases as Soviet soldiers went home. This led to a little bit of friction between Hungary and its former ally as the Soviets demanded that Hungary compensate them for the military equipment that they were leaving behind. All this might have had an impact on the investigation into the death of István. By the summer of 1999, Zoltan was getting desperate for money, but he saw an opportunity in the house that he owned with his 49-year-old brother who was also named István. The pair started drinking, and at some point Zoltan floated the idea of selling the house. When István refused to go along with it, a fight ensued which ended with Zoltan strangling him. The creature then loaded the body into a wheelbarrow which he used to cart it out of the village. Once he was a ways out and away from prying eyes, Zoltan buried it where it would be found months later by a homeless man. Once again, police had little to work with as far as evidence, less in fact than in the case of the stepfather due to the deterioration of the remains. Having gotten away with 2 murders, Zoltan saw no problem with doing it again, and he continued to have money problems. His solution was to target the elder residents of Szentkeralszabadja, and this time he planned his crimes much more than he had before. He claims that as he watched horror movies, Zoltan developed an interest in the use of ropes. In his free time, the creature began practicing various knots to prepare for his next attacks. On the night of July 7, 2002, he broke into the home of an 88-year-old woman named Caroline Horvath. He clubbed the elderly woman, then tied her up with a rope around her neck that was also looped around her wrists and legs. As Horvath struggled to free herself, it tightened until she could no longer breathe. Just under a year later, he did the same thing as he had with Horvath, this time targeting an 83-year-old man named Poloshenko on June 22, 2003. Zoltan beat the old man before tying him up in the same way as he had with his previous victim. With 2 elderly victims found in the same way, police were extremely aware that some of the deaths in the village over the past several years had not been random one-off incidents. The community was also in terror, knowing that one of their neighbors was taking the lives of the most vulnerable among them. After he had skated away scot-free 3 times, Ember began to get arrogant. He was drunk when he broke into the home of an 82-year-old woman named Caroline Pinter on March 7, 2004. Once again, using a rope, he restrained the woman in the same way as he had before, then ransacked her home as she took her last breaths. Perhaps because he was drunk, or he had become so sure that he could not be caught, this time he left behind evidence. Police would find DNA left behind at the crime scene, and whether he cut himself and bled, or something else, the Hungarian sources do not specify. But in any case, police knew that their suspect lived in the small village, and so they simply took samples from the 50 shadiest people in the area, with Zoltan Ember being among them. As the monster continued living life as usual, completely unaware of what evidence he had left behind, police were quickly zeroing in on the killer. And a few days later, the DNA test results came in, pointing to Ember as the culprit. When they brought the 42-year-old in for questioning, he denied any involvement at first, but once confronted with the evidence, Zoltan became fairly candid about his crimes. In his confession, the creature described what he had done. He would even tell investigators about the murder of his brother and stepfather. By 2007, he had had both his trial and appeal for the 5 homicides and been sent to prison with a life sentence. During the trials, he seemed unconcerned about the crimes and utterly unremorseful, grinning throughout portions and making bizarre statements to the press, including to insinuate that he had more victims that were unknown to police. Despite his bravado during the trial, Zoltan was not ready to spend a life behind bars. He soon began trying to end himself, once with a blade and once with poison. But on April 24, 2015, after 8 years of being locked up, he was successful, using a bedsheet to hang himself.